You are about to enter the Shockwave Skull Sessions podcast on shockwaveskullsessions.com. And now your host, Bob Nalbandian.
Here. All right, we got the Shockwave Skull Sessions podcast for all you 80s metal fanatics out there. This is a episode you will thoroughly enjoy. I got my partner again, Tom Brennan. Looks like he might be a regular, my Irish buddy from Waterford, Ireland.
I hope
now,
so.
Where are you? North Carolina or something?
Yeah, just outside of Charlotte. Yeah, about 30 miles south of Charlotte. Right on the South Carolina, North Carolina border. So, yeah, living in this nice 70-degree weather today, so not complaining.
All right. And we got two great authors. We got Tom Beaujour and Rich Bienstock from the new book. Is the book out now, or it is coming out real soon, right?
Yes, March 16th it's out.
All right, titled Nothing But a Good Time. And just to so there's no confusion, I know there were a few podcasts that had other authors from another book. Apparently, there's another book out of the UK with the same title or similar title. So,
or an identical title. I think
it is identical.
I think his doesn't have an umlaut on it, but other than that, utterly identical.
Yes,
that's about it. Yeah, it's funny.
That's what confused me a bit. But your book will be coming out on I guess on digital and physical copies then, huh?
It
digital,
will, yes.
physical, and an audiobook.
Audiobook. Wow.
Oh, cool.
All right. Well.
There you go.
All right. Well, we both, Tom out of Ireland, I thought we'd get a different perspective of an Irish guy. He grew up in the 80s metal scene, and he was a huge fan of all the LA and the, what they call hair metal bands and all that kind of stuff. And of course, I grew up in LA. I was a big part of that. I had a fanzine called The Headbanger, and I covered a lot of these bands in the local clubs, seeing Motley Crue to Metallica to Slayer to, Poison, Rat, all those bands. Their first incarnations, Steelers in first incarnation before Yngwie joined. I saw several different versions of Rat. You disappeared on us, Tom. Did you click the camera?
Fixing the dogs, I guess.
Yeah, maybe.
But anyway, Tom, I was going to say, why don't you start off, Tom, talking about your experience with the 80s scene, and then we'll get right into the book.
Sure. So I kick off, and so from Waterford, Ireland, small town southeast of Ireland, so a million miles from the LA scene. But my original into the rock and metal world was probably about 80, 81, and I heard Thin Lizzy, and I had two tapes, actually, two physical tapes. So I had Saxon Wheels of Steel and The Adventures of Thin Lizzy, which was like a best of, which I don't think had a US release, like a best of, whatever. And that's all I had. And then Maiden got introduced a little bit, and then AC/DC came into the world. But so that was all I knew. I had these four tapes you just played on rotation. So remember, but then there was no internet. I wasn't reading Kerrang at that time, so I had no idea how to find out anymore. But we spoke with this before, Bob. There's always that one guy who has all the imports, who knows everybody, who heard of all these obscure bands that you've never heard of. So I latched onto him immediately. So he was introducing me then to the LA scene and the early kind of the birth of that, and bands like Hanoi Rocks and you name it. And then, of course, Kerrang magazine, I discovered that in probably, I'm guessing, around 83, something like that. And that was just the door opening. I mean, that was my Google then. That was the only way I had that information. And Kerrang at that time was out weekly, it was every Thursday, I remember. And I would walk about 3 or 4 miles. I wasn't driving at the time. I was only a kid at 13. I would walk 3-4 miles, all weathers, to pick up your Kerrang magazine to see what was happening. And they always had a section on like what was happening in the LA metal scene. And that's when you started hearing about bands like Rat, Motley, and Dokken and Poison, whatever. And that was my introduction. And then it was just a dam busting open. And I've been a metal fan, since 1981, and here we are in 2021. Nothing has changed.
All right. Well, dude, I got to tell you guys, both Tom and I thoroughly enjoyed the book.
Awesome.
The research you guys put into it is just unbelievable. And, I was mentioning to Rich earlier, I really love the fact that you really delved from the late 70s on. And, that was something, I was telling him I did the Inside Metal series, documentary series. And we touch on that in the pioneers of LA hard rock and metal. And the funny thing is there, because this was obviously before MTV, before, a lot of the stuff, before, the record companies started signing bands, we're talking Van Halen era. So there was, apart from Van Halen, not many people knew about bands like Snow or Greg Leon, or a lot of people that you have featured in there, and a lot of great stories from the early days and stuff, that I didn't even know, researching through the documentary. So again, it was really, really brilliant. The fact that you went from the beginning to the end, and that the book is just straight on quotes from the artist, and the way that you pieced it, this was almost, it's funny because it's almost like piecing together the movie to make it flow perfect. So you must have just took hours upon hours digging through quotes and then puzzling it together, because it really flows really well. Like you'll have someone, Brian Slagle say something, and then Nikki Sixx will kind of almost respond to it, and then it'll just goes from there. But I just love the way it's put together, and it's just the amount of people you got on this, from major industry people to Cliff Bernsteins to Alan Niven, managed Guns N' Roses and Great White. Of course, Bernstein managed Def Leppard at the time, Queensryche, and of course still manages Metallica, and Tesla. That's right. He managed Tesla. Right. He managed Armored Saint for a little while as well.
Dawkins.
There you go. You got some great quotes from Don Dokken, Nikki Sixx. I mean, Slash.
Oh, there.
I mean, everyone. Dee Snider. I mean, from the New York scene to the LA scene. I didn't even really get deep into the. I don't know if you covered a lot of the British people, but I know you go into both coasts, and you really cover the whole gamut, man. But anyway, why don't you kind of talk about how this whole came together, and because I know you've been working on this for a couple of years, researching this.
I mentioned this a little bit to you before, Bob, but Tom and I spent many years, over a decade, working together at Guitar World magazine. We both grew up on this music. We love this music. We have played this music. We've interviewed these guys, many times over the years for the magazine and for other outlets. And it was something that we just always talked about doing. And I think it was something that, we were both sort of like a little bit nervous to take on because of our passion for it. We kind of knew it would become what it became, which was just this enormous, really deep dive into this world. But eventually we just decided, let's do it. Let's write the book that we would want to read before somebody else tries to do it, and that's what we did. We just decided at some point that let's give it a shot. And we just dove in like full on. That was probably 4 years ago, I'd say. And here we are.
It took 4. It took, I was looking back at my calendar, like different, because we've been, sending books to people that we interviewed. And so like, I was like looking back when I interviewed Tom Kiefer, like Jeff LaBar, and it's like, whoa, that was 3 years ago. Wow. It took a really long time. And, but it was something that, we had both really wanted to do. I don't think it would be possible to do it alone. I mean, I guess somebody could. I couldn't, certainly.
Yeah, me neither.
The volume of interviews and research and preparation, and then just even the ability to slide in for the other guy, Dee Snider can talk tomorrow at 2. You're not going to reschedule Dee Snider, so somebody's going to be able to grab it. I think also when we started in journalism in the mid-90s in music journalism, it was a time where we weren't able to interview a lot of these artists because it was in the dark period.
Sure.
When these things were
even with Guitar World though too, huh? You really I started in Guitar World in February of 1994. But you were still covering the shredders like Yngwie and that kind of stuff, no? Or not so much?
Yngwie, yes.
CC, no.
Right.
I did say guitar shredders. So.
Right.
Guys who had been on the cover. Guys who had been on the cover a couple of years earlier, like who are Nuno, Red Beach, the Skid Row guys, all those guys, it was almost like it never happened.
Right. Yeah.
When I got there in '94, it was Soundgarden, it was
Oh, okay.
The Offspring. It was this. It was really like that period right after the music collapsed, where nobody was writing about it, nobody was talking about it, and so we were like kind of getting into the business and weren't able to interview anyone that we grew up with. I mean, Yngwie, yes, but you know, once in a while probably there'd be something on George Lynch, but it was really almost like it like had never happened. And
that's strange for a guitar magazine. I do remember the change in Guitar World, and that you did cover a lot of that. But seeing it's a guitar-based magazine, I mean, the grunge. I mean, how many guitar players could you cover there? You know, and but you know,
you'd be surprised.
You'd be surprised, yes.
But you're also there's still Slash and all those guys, of course.
Sure.
But
like the alternative, the Chili
yeah.
Peppers, I guess, and that kind of stuff.
But once you got into the 2000s, it came back a little bit. But in the 90s, no.
What caught my attention immediately was obviously Corey Taylor gave the forward. I was going, okay, so Slipknot, and we're talking about this. So that just got my attention immediately. Was that deliberate to kind of get someone outside of that realm? Obviously, when I read like his story, you know, growing up on it, being a big, you know, Kiss fan or whatever he was talking about, but was that something deliberate to get Corey Taylor, because he's a big name, clearly, you know, Slipknot will sell 1 million albums in a heartbeat, but he's outside of the genre that we're talking about? Because I just think that worked exceptionally well, because I was thinking, wow, Corey Taylor is giving the intro.
It was a great forward, yeah.
I think it was kind of like, if we could, who could we get who's like us but really famous? And that was sort of what it was. I mean, he shared, seriously, like, he shares the passion and the enthusiasm for it. And so having someone outside of, you know, somebody, it would be weird to have somebody from the scene be like, we were awesome. Let me tell you how awesome all of our, like, I was in Rat and we were awesome, and that band was like, but to have Corey do it, and who has like this sort of cross, you know, metal fans like him too. Slipknot, you know, so he's got kind of like a credibility, and like with like the heavy music crowd, and even reluctantly the you know, the music press. So we thought it would be a great idea to have someone like that who's also a fan, who could sort of write something that what we would have liked to say, but we've already written enough in this book. You know, and he got it in like right on time, and it was awesome.
And did you go for anybody? Like, was there anybody else for the forward? Obviously, we spoke about Corey, but was there anyone else in mind? Was he number one? Is there somebody you couldn't get, or how did that come? Or was it just Corey? I want to have Corey do the forward.
There was like a short list of people.
Yeah, we talked about a few different people, but you know, he was on that short list, like Tom said, and he just seemed like the perfect kind of guy. Because as like Tom said, I mean, we didn't want obviously someone from that time, because they would just be talking about how great they are, but also there's 200 voices in the book from that time, and so to have on top of that a forward of one of these guys talking again about it just seemed to not make sense. And then with a guy like Corey, it's also showing like, hey, you could love this music, and it doesn't have to lead you to being in a Motley Crue type of band with big hair and leather and all. Like, it could lead you, just that passion for the music could lead you to do whatever. It could lead you to Slipknot if that's what happens. But this is the music that Corey grew up on, and it probably in many ways like led him to where he is today.
Plus, he has Stone Sour, which is totally different than Slipknot, and completely different fan base. So maybe not completely different, but it's interesting how candid these guys were. And I was talking to you earlier, particularly some of the stories and their memory, how well their memory was, and I love the way how they bounce off each other. Like, you'll hear George Lynch say something, and then Don Dokken will say something, and it was slightly different, but kind of the same. And you know, everyone was kind of in
when it's Don and George.
Maybe not a great example.
Well, no, I was surprised about some of the stuff that George did say. Kind of said, I admit that to this, and you know, it wasn't all, but I said them too, because everyone knows about the Don and George kind of, you know, thing, but the way it all kind of tied together. But I mentioned the story that I was so impressed with, because I had interviewed him several times, and I knew you know, Jack Russell in the Dante Fox days, and I saw them, and I had always heard the stories, you know, I remember when he went to jail, and he kind of talked about it, but never gave any details. He said, "Yeah, I went to jail over something real stupid," and but I never got the full story. It's amazing that he actually tells that full story of what happened so honestly and so candidly in this book. And that was just one of the quotes that stuck out, but so many others where the people were just very honest. And I think you would never be able to get that if you interviewed them back 20, 30 years ago, especially not back in the 80s. It would just all be about, I'm a rock star, this macho thing. But now I think, and that's, the thing I noticed, again, doing the documentaries, when you talk to these guys 20, 30, 40 years later, in some cases, there's no more kind of that ego or competition. They're just, they're older family guys in their 50s or 60s sometimes, and they're just kind of reflecting back. So there's really, and that's kind of what it is. And it's just a really, really honest outlook. Again, I'm really impressed about the magnitude of the interviews you guys did on this. Unbelievable.
We talked a lot about how even if we had tried to do this book 10 years ago, I mean, maybe 10, but like it would have been it's a good time to talk to these people because everybody's sort of in a good headspace. I mean, at least before COVID, they were out working, they were out playing shows. A lot, we heard a lot from people. I'm making more, like I'm taking home.
Yeah, I read that. More
money now than I did then. They get to have their lives. They do their fly dates. I think people that the people that we interviewed are now in a position to see like that their music made an impact, and it's like and so they're willing to talk about it, and they're not bitter. I think if you had tried to do this book in 1997 or 1998, it would have been a whole different story.
Absolutely. I was going to say that. Yeah.
Just a question then. Are all of you said that the book is like, 4 years in the making. So are all of the quotes from the previous 4 years, or are there any of them excerpts from previous interviews done by whomever? Are they all brand new? Because when I saw something from Vito Bratta, I was going, well, that's impressed me right there, because this guy is living in a cave with John Sykes, I'm guessing, because he doesn't do this shit. So I was impressed with that. So did you get him in the last couple of years because he's kind of underground?
Yeah, well, and I'll let Tom speak specifically about Vito, because we did get Vito, and Tom and Vito are like this now, apparently. But
yeah.
But for the most part, we did all these interviews. There's some stuff that was not an interview done for this book, but maybe like 10% of the stuff. And even most of that is stuff that Tom and I, interviews we had done over the years for Guitar World or for other publications, and we just had all this great material, again, because a lot of times you couldn't write that much about these guys, and we, loving this stuff, would just ask them all types of stuff. Like, we had so much information, so when something was fitting, we'd stick it in there. But for the most part, it's all new stuff, including Vito. Tom?
Yeah, that was sort of my great quest for this book. It is possible that this book was an excuse completely just to talk to Vito Bratta. Like it was, growing up, he was like my guy. He was like my guitar. Like, this guy is just the shit, man. Like the melodicism and the riffs. I just loved White Line. Growing up on the East Coast, I grew up in New York City. WSOU, which was the Seton Hall radio station, Pirate Radio, which was like our metal station.
Sure.
They were playing White Line from day one, the Grand Slam record, before they were even signed on
Brian McAvoy.
Yeah. So I was into White Lion even before they were, like, since really early on, and talking to Vito, because he hadn't done a lot of interviews, was really important to me. And we just got lucky, man. Like, I have to give credit. It was one of those things where it was a Hail Mary. I got Eddie Trunk's email, and because he's the last person who interviewed Vito Bratta like 7 years ago or 13 years ago. I can't remember which one it is. And I know, and we talked back and forth, and I said, I'm a Revolver guy, blah, blah, blah. and he sent through an email, and for whatever reason, it must have landed in Vito's inbox on the right day. You know what I mean? And it was like, oh, I'll do that. I was kind of like, wait, what? And we did I think we did like 3.5 hours. We did like a 90-minute interview one day and a 90-minute interview the next, because we also talked at length at the beginning of the interview about sort of the early East Coast days when he was in a cover band. They used to play, you know, on the same scene as Twisted Sister. So there was a lot.
I wasn't aware of that. Yeah, that was really interesting.
Yeah. But so that was there were a couple interviews like that were really like exciting to get, you know.
Sure.
Is there anybody you didn't get that you really? I know Vito was a win. Is there anybody that you had, you know, on your list and just couldn't get or couldn't reach him or didn't respond, like a John Sykes or something like that? You know, anybody out there?
I think that, you know, there were some people that I think we went into it and we just accepted that we were not going to get them, but I also don't know how important they would have been anyway. I mean, a good example would be John Bon Jovi. Mm-hmm. Mostly because, I mean, he doesn't do a lot of stuff, and also he certainly doesn't do stuff where he's talking about this kind of thing anymore. No. So, you know, so we could go into it just assuming that wasn't going to happen. We might have asked at one point somebody, and, you know, it just didn't come to fruition. But then it was also a case of, okay, well, Bon Jovi is not actually even going to be that big a part of this story, because while they're obviously part of this world, especially their formative years with John on his own happened so outside of this scene, right, that to go deep into it would have been great to tell the John Bon Jovi story. I don't know if it would have helped us that much as far as telling the story of this scene and how it progressed. And it would have just eaten up a lot of the book. So we knew early on, like, he wasn't really going to be a big part of it anyway. So it didn't really matter if we got him or not. Whereas a lot of the Bon Jovi story comes through just from the bands that played with them, certainly from the Skid Row guys, certainly from Dave Sabo
and Cinderella.
Yeah. And the Cinderella guys, right. So you see...
And you had Tito too, right? The drummer?
Yeah, Tito's in there. Yeah. Tico, I'm sorry.
Tito.
Yeah, and he spoke to us. But you know, and John's in there because he's kind of this thread, you're right, like weaving through the Cinderella story and the Skid Row story, especially the Skid Row story. But it didn't seem necessary to get him in order to tell any of that story.
And the other thing, going back to the importance of, we said, the timing of this, and why I think, again, the timing is so important, because this could very well be one of the very last documentations, a thorough documentation on the 80s scene. And when getting these guys, because I know even a lot of guys you would interview this have since passed away since the book, and more, you know, unfortunately, that's just the reality of especially, you know, guys in the 80s. I mean, Frankie Banali, I mean, all these, you know, Eddie Van Halen, you know, people from that whole era, you know. So it was really great that you were able to get these people while they still had a great memory. And now you mentioned about, you know, some of these interviews were 3 hours, and as I say, the book is just kind of, you know, quotes in many cases, several quotes from the artist kind of pieced together. Is there going to be a follow-up, or are you going to do a book, like full books on, I mean, you know, like you said, 3-hour interview with Vita, you could do a whole, you know, White Lion book. Are there anything that else you got out of the interviews, or was it all just for this book?
That's a good question.
Was any of this on film, by the way, or was it all just?
It was not. No, it was all. Yeah. Some of it was done in person, some interviews, but nothing was filmed. I mean, I would say, to answer your question, we have not considered doing a second book. I'm sure that Tom right now is thinking about doing that White Lion book, now that you mentioned it. But the book itself has been optioned for a documentary.
Oh, wow. So
that could happen. We'll just have to wait and see. But yeah, I mean, you know, as far as doing these longer interviews too, a lot of those were for these artists where, like Vito and White Lion, there's a certain number of bands where we actually weave their entire history throughout the book, and White Lion being one of those. Poison, Guns N' Roses, Motley Crue, Vixen, forgetting a couple others that we Rat, but
Nelson.
Skid Row, Nelson. Yeah. So these artists we did longer interviews with, sometimes multiple interviews, because they just keep coming back. And we use those bands to kind of show the entire arc of what a lot of these bands went through.
Mm. And I thought what was really interesting is you got the whole perspective from the artists and the label people. You know, you would talk to a Jason Flom or Tom Wally or producers. Yeah. And I mentioned managers, the Cliff Bernsteins, and you did a whole chapter on Michael Anthony, which I thought was great. That really just gave a whole, different kind of perspective, the business side to the artist side, and just really, really cool the way you piece everything together. Again, I thought was really brilliant. I love the titles, the contents titles. You would take a quote from one of the musicians, because I'm like, when I first got it, I go, what the fuck? You would figure it'd be like in a time frame where you would, the LA scene or the New York scene, you're getting these, and I go, what? So, I just had to go through it from the beginning, and then I kind of got it where it was going. But it was very cleverly put together.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Tom. Oh, sorry. No, go ahead. No, okay.
Just on the I'm just going to answer the same thing. I talk about the same thing, the producers, because that for me was almost important to who the band were, because if I just wrote something like Beau Hill or Michael Wagner, Ron Nevison or whatever. So when you saw that White Liner coming out on a new album and it's produced by Michael Wagner, or Ozzy is being produced by Ron Nevison, that immediately in my mind said it's going to be good, not so good. Like, as an example, I don't like Ron Nevison's production at all. I just don't like it. I like what he did with Thin Lizzy and Nightlife, because it has that raw, that kind of gritty 70s sound. But if you think of some of the harp albums he did, or the Ozzy stuff like Shot in the Dark or whatever, it has that over the top kind of tinny sound. It's missing a bit of grit. So my point is that if I saw someone with Beau Hill, and like you had a Winger and Rat as an example, you knew there was going to be power behind it. So the producers played a real key role. They were kind of almost like a fifth member of the band for that period of time. That was very off-putting for me. Or conversely, I would write on if I knew that a Michael Wagner was involved as opposed to somebody else. Whereas today, I think producers are kind of lost in the mix, because people are just downloading. They don't read the liner notes. They don't know who's involved. Back then, you read every single line of every single person, who the special guest was. You couldn't wait to just open it. And the producer, for me, was a really, really key part of what that album at that point, which I hadn't have heard, was likely to sound like, and whether I was likely to even like it, because it was off-putting on some producers for me.
My day job is recording bands. Like, I have a studio and stuff, so I basically use it as an opportunity to suck every bit of information out of there.
Right.
Like, when you're asking about like what happens in a 3-hour interview with the producers, there's an extra 35 or 40 minutes of me like being like, so what mics did you use on
right. Geeking out, yeah.
They would tolerate me.
See, back then they'd probably be reluctant to tell you. Back in the 80s,
now
they wouldn't want their tricks being stolen. But now they're like, who cares? There's no recording studios now anyway, so who cares?
I think it's important to get the perspective of the other people in the room who kind of, for the producers, especially then, there's a lot of pressure on them. Especially once you get into the later 80s, and it's evident that if a record is done right, it could sell 5 million copies.
Mm-hmm.
That's a lot of pressure on a Beau Hill or a Tom Werman, and so they're observing the whole situation completely differently. They're the quote unquote adult in the room. I mean, it's what they're being paid to do, but they're also just seeing the whole process from a different point of view. And you even go there. A lot of those great Michael Wagner, it seems, was like a band's producer. Everyone you talk to who worked with Michael Wagner loves him. But with like Beau Hill or Tom Werman, there's not that many people who are just like, that dude was the nicest guy. Because those guys were hired to herd the cats, and to deliver these like products that again, if you got it right and you had the right ballad and the right sound and you pushed the songs and edited them correctly and made it right, there was a huge amount of money at stake. So I think it's important to have them and the managers and people like that who are focused on making this whole machinery work and are seeing these bands from the outside. I think that for me was really important to have that perspective.
Now, going back to that, do you think that kind of killed the 80s metal sound, that all these bands sounded generic? They had to push, from the pressure from the labels and the producers to get that hit ballad, that power ballad, or that hit song, or get an outside writer to come in. And then, as you said, when the 90s came and grunge and alternative music took over, even, you said even Guitar World just, which surprised me that even a guitar magazine would cut out all, because let's face it, the 80s guitar players, they were, far, far superior than what came out on the 90s scene as far as, technicality and musicianship. But they were virtually ignored in a lot of the musician magazines. So it was just a straight out thing where they just tried to erase that whole scene out of, it was almost kind of an embarrassment. And again, I think it goes back to, because you talk to a lot of these bands and they say, especially, a lot of the new wave of British heavy metal bands, that came across, after Def Leppard made it huge, Saxon, Tigers of Pantang, Diamond Head, all these bands were really were pressured to write these hit songs, and they changed their sound. Arbor Saints, another example. I know that when they went in with Michael James Jackson to the studio, the producer really put the pressure on, we got to make this a hit. We got to gear it to radio and MTV. That was kind of the key. And I really think that was kind of the downfall, because you look at the bands that stuck to their guns, Metallica, they never put out a video. They didn't have to until the one video on Injustice for All, and so many other bands, the heavier bands that kind of stuck to their guns. Of course, Pantera, they were around since the 80s. That's kind of a glam band. But they, went and did their sound, and they survived through the 90s. What are your thoughts on that, both of you? Rich, we'll start with you, Rich.
Well, I think, you see this thing where people are, whether it's the bands or the producers, you get, especially by the late 80s, you get into this really tight loop where the bands in the late 80s are influenced by the bands from the early 80s. So you have your bands coming out that are influenced by Motley Crue and Rat and all these bands that are still in the prime of their career. So they're sounding like guys who made a record last year. It's like that. It's that close of a time period they're referencing. But then from the producer perspective, and Tom can probably speak to this a little bit more because he spoke to Beau Hill and Tom Werman and those guys. But one of the producers we have in there is Howard Benson, who nowadays is probably actually the biggest name out of all of them, because he went on to have massive success with My Chemical Romance and I think Kelly Clarkson and All American Rejects, like really massive producer.
And Bang Tango.
His three of his first jobs were the first Bang Tango record, the first Tough record, the first Pretty Boy Floyd record. And I think the order is probably Bang Tango, Pretty Boy Floyd, Tough, I guess. But he did a long interview for the book, and he was really great because he freely admitted that he was really green at the time, and he was basically trying to make a record that sounded like a Beau Hill record, that sounded like a Tom Werman record, and didn't quite know how to do it. And also, admittedly, it depends what your tastes are, but he also wasn't working with Rat and Motley Crue. He was working with Bang Tango and Pretty Boy Floyd and so on. So maybe, the material's not there either, but he is just trying to recreate a sound that is not necessarily his sound and is not necessarily even the sound of these bands, but it's the sound that you just think people want, and certainly what the labels want from you. So you try to do that. And, those are not, I think he might even say in the book, the Pretty Boy Floyd record is a record that he left off of his resume for a long time. And we speak to Christy Crash Majors from Pretty Boy Floyd, and I think that he also complained that he knew that Howard Benson left this record off of his resume for a long time. But, he wasn't doing, whether or not he even likes the bands, he's aware that he was not doing his best work because he was just trying to do something. He's trying to do probably the thing that's the opposite of why he got into this. Like, he's just trying to do something that sounds like someone else as opposed to make his own thing out of this. So you start to run into that problem with a lot of these bands and the people capturing their sound.
Speaking of Howard Benson, he's in this Bang Tango documentary that's on YouTube. And he seems like a very nice guy, very cool, very honest. Yeah, he was. And I was kind of shocked to see that because it's kind of a low budget, like some of the, but very good documentary. Even if you're not a Bang Tango fan, it's pretty interesting. Tom, what about you? What your thoughts?
I think it's the double-edged sword, right? We wouldn't probably have written this book or be talking about all of these bands 30 plus years later if they hadn't been huge. And part of part of filling the arenas and capturing the imagination of like a whole generation is that these records were hits. And part of them being hits is that they had the A-team working on them, so.
Right.
Did it become formulaic by the end? Absolutely. But this was not, this was a music that began in a very DIY fashion, but with Motley Crue and all these bands doing their own records, but it was a big bit, it was a big business. And I don't think the bands didn't want it to be that way either. I think, we talked to these bands and they're like, we got a deal. And then we were opening for Bon Jovi. It was amazing. It was like a time when being in a rock band was like being a Major League Baseball player or in the NFL. Like once you get in there and the stakes are high and you do what it takes, you don't get the tour support and the bus and the pyro without the record that sounds like $1 million and maybe costs $1 million. And I think when a great band with great songs also spend a ton of money making a record with a very good producer, like a Dr. Feelgood or something like that, then you get something completely amazing. So did it become a little bloated? Yes, but I think that the flip side is that that's part of why this music was able to make such an impact on such a big number of people, is that it was the pop music of the day. That was what was on the radio and what was on MTV. And to get there, you do it. And it's funny, even during the grunge era, you watch, there's a movie about Patty Schemmel, the drummer from Hole, where for the Celebrity Skin record, she gets benched and Bobby Rondinelli comes in.
Right.
And there's other stories you hear, record, like there were people making big budget records to have hits in the 90s too. I think it just was not openly discussed. It's Urge Overkill Saturation, which is an amazing record. The drumming on it is much better. That's all I'm going to say is drumming on it is much better than, so like, I think that it kept happening. I think whenever there's major labels and money at stake where you've got to, you got to sell 500,000 records to break even.
Yeah.
You're not going to just be like, the drummer sucks. Let them do whatever they want. I think you don't get your blockbuster without a director who can direct it.
But I think I was looking at an article recently in 1987. I think U2 were number one with the Joshua Tree, like that sold a bazillion records. But the top 10 was made up of 7 hair bands. So it was the pop music of the day. I mean, your average band was like selling 1 million records, and your really good was like a Dr. Feelgood ended up selling 6 million, and Quiet Riot a couple of years before, we didn't even talk about yet, sold 6 million, obviously with Metal Health. But two things actually. Dee Snider, you mentioned Dee Snider, but Twisted Sister were pretty much done by 85 and Come Out and Play came in, because they had Stay Hungry sold 4 million or something like that, I believe. Come Out and Play came out. That did $500,000, I think, because they released bad singles and there was stuff going on internally with the band. But by 86, I know they came out with Lovers for Suckers thereafter, but by 86, 87, Twisted Sister were done. And yet they were the epitome of what an 80s rock band were, which is the big hair, the lyrics, the big choruses, the theatrics. And yet they just, not that they missed the boat, but they only got a little piece of it and they were just put out the pasture. I read Dee Snider's book and he talks about it in depth. By mid to late 80s. They were done right in the middle and the height of that time.
Yeah, and this is, Tom and I have talked about this a lot. We talked about this when we were doing the book, that the two bands that really break it open, I mean, really the one band is Quiet Riot, and then Twisted Sister walks through after that. But these are both 70s bands. They're not 80s bands. And they both talk about it in the book. Frankie Banali talked about it a lot. Dee talks about it. So by the time it's ironic that this music that people think, you know, it's just these pretty boys dressed up as women and like big hair and all that. And it's all about the look. The two bands that really walk through that door are two bands that started before all of that, and in all honesty are not the greatest looking bands. You know, like Kevin Dubrow is not Bret Michaels, and Twisted Sister. You know, I mean, Dee always proudly says they were whatever linebackers in high heels or whatever. You know, so but those are the two bands that break through on MTV and break through in a very visual way, and also those are the two bands that don't sustain. Like the sort of path that you just gave, the arc that you gave for Twisted Sister is the same thing for Quiet Riot, except it actually probably ends even quicker for them.
Right.
And yet both of them are multi-platinum acts a few years earlier. And then all these bands that followed them are the ones that really kind of reap the rewards in the late 80s.
Sure.
Yeah, and they're aware of it, and they all talk about it in the book. And I think there's one exchange. Dee Snider talks about going out to dinner with Kevin Dubrow, I think in like around that time, like 84, 80, probably like 85-ish, when they both have had all this success now. And he says Kevin is saying something to him to the extent of like, isn't this great? You know, all this has happened for us. We worked so hard and so long, and here we are. And Dee is like, he's not thrilled and he's not happy. He's actually kind of pissed off because he's like, I can't believe it took this long. You know, I can't believe what we had, the shit that we had to crawl through, and the way we had to scratch and claw to get here 10 years later. So he was grateful, but he was also aware of the long history that they had behind this to get to that point. And yeah, it didn't last that much longer for them.
But then you had a Whitesnake. Sorry, Bob. Yeah, like you had a Whitesnake who come from that. Like they were like a British blues. Like their early Whitesnake stuff was just phenomenal. I think far superior than anything they did in the 80s. But then obviously, you know, Coverdale hooked up with John Sykes and obviously Steve Vai thereafter and sold 10 million albums. So they were like, Dee Snider must be looking at Coverdale, who's a little bit prettier but also older, perhaps, kind of looking and going, how the fuck is this guy selling 10 million albums? You know, I'm back to playing clubs again. And even bands like Kiss, who, you know, make up off in 83, and then by 86, 87, they just started to look ridiculous. Like Asylum, Animalized, that era, like with all the big fluorescent gloves and shit, and, you know, Gene Simmons a blusher on, like they look ridiculous. But they managed to keep a semblance of record sales. Like they were constantly selling 1 million, 1.5. I think it was never anything bigger than that. But they were playing arenas. So there was that kind of anomaly of the Quiet Riot and the Twisted Sister kind of disappeared. And then the rest of them kind of, you know, blossomed with Whitesnake. And then, you know, some other band, even Priest, I mean, jumped all over the blonde hair on Turbo and shit. You know, even I like Turbo and Defenders of Fate, but they just started to look ridiculous. But the music was pretty solid. So there was a lot of things going on, a lot of different moving parts there.
I think that what happens though the reason possibly that Twisted Sister and Quiet Riot are an anomaly and they're not able to sustain is just how successful they were. Like if you know, there were not a lot of videos on MTV at that time, and those songs, you know, Quiet Riot Mental Health knocked Synchronicity out of the #1 spot. It was huge. You could not escape those bands. So that much success, like when you sell, I don't know, 5 million records or whatever, 6 million, who even knows? It's very difficult to reinvent yourself, and it's also very, you know, you burn people out. You know, Dee Snider says this thing in the book where he's like, he gets a letter from, you know, a young woman who's like, you and Kajagoogoo are my favorite bands. and he said at that point, he's like, he knew that they were in trouble. But that's because they were so famous. I mean, you could argue like Def Leppard managed to pull it through, but to be that omnipresent, then what do you do after that? I mean, there's no way you're ever going to sell as many records, But also, I think that they just probably had been doing it for so long. You know, they weren't. I don't think that maybe kids like 14-year-olds or 13-year-olds looked at them like 2 years later, 1985 or something. You look at the guys in Quiet Riot; they're in their mid-30s. They don't look like Michaels and Nicky and stuff. Like they're definitely one click older. So maybe they weren't really connecting.
Sure.
Yeah.
Fair point. Yeah.
Plus, those follow-up albums, they were not as good. I mean, Love Is for Suckers and the follow-up Quiet Riot records. I mean, they tried to capitalize on that success of the, and it just the songs just weren't there. But, I think when you get that big, that quick, they turned MTV and everything, they turned metal into a fad. When you mention a girl saying, "Oh, I like, Twisted Sister and Kaja Gugu," she probably doesn't know the difference between metal and new wave. And you got to remember the whole metal new thing dying to grunge. That really happened with the new wave scene. And I mean, you look at in the early '80s, who dominated MTV? The Duran Durans, the Police, the Go-Go's, the Motels, Kaja Gugu, Flock of Seagulls, the Stray Cats. All that by the mid '80s died. It's almost like it killed the grunge killed the metal scene. It was almost like metal kind of killed the new wave scene. I mean, a lot of the bands, the Police and of course U2 and some of those bands obviously carried on to be huge, but the majority of those, I mean, MTV in the early '80s, it was all new wave. I mean, there were so many bands, and it was, and the same thing happened in the '80s. Growing up in LA and seeing the bands and hearing about the Starwood, and then finally seeing, like I said, Motley and all these bands from the clubs. A lot of people don't realize Quiet Riot have been around since the 74, 75. Y&T was around since 74. Yeah. Twisted Sister was around since 72 or 73. So a lot of people think, as soon as the 80s, these bands were new. And what you were talking about the latter 80s bands, you did have your original, and you can say what you want about Motley and Rat and all those bands. Black and Blue, Warrior, Armored Saint, Malice, go Dawkins. They worked their ass off. They didn't just come from nowhere, and they were busting their ass in the clubs and doing all that stuff. And then the latter 80s bands, when Poison and Warrant and all those bands started coming over, it was like instant success. And then everyone came over, and it just became a fad. And they didn't, not that those bands didn't work. Poison busted their ass promoting themselves, but it was a very quick thing. They didn't have the longevity of, say like a Twisted Sister or a Whitesnake or a Quiet Riot or even a Motley Crue. Of course, they were all in different bands. Tommy was with Greg Leon, Nicky was in London, Don Dawkins was in Airborne with Bobby Bloxer. So all these guys were playing around in the late 70s, sometimes selling out clubs. And then you had the unfortunate bands like Snow, A La Carte, Stormer, all these bands that were huge, selling out the Smile, selling out the Starwood and the Whiskey Greg Leon Invasion with our Sweet 19. And unfortunately, they kind of quit before their time, or they never really made it into that 80s, hair metal thing. Obviously, some of the members, Carlos went on with Quiet Riot, and you had certain members from the bands that did that. But the point is, those bands back then, they worked and they put in hours and hours. Great White, with Dante Fox again, going back, it was years it took them to succeed. And I think at the time when MTV and the whole hair metal thing became this big trend, it was just, let's sign everyone we can. And that's what happened with grunge. Same thing happened with grunge. Same thing happens with all the things. Everyone thinks they're so original and we're doing this new thing. And then this is the new thing. It's going to last forever. And then get the copycat bands and it ruins that scene too. So go figure. Anyway,
No. I mean, I think you bring up a lot of good points there, and especially in the early part of this book, that was one of the main things that we were trying to communicate, was how DIY this scene was, how it wasn't a foregone conclusion that, pretty soon something called MTV is going to be created and you guys are going to be all over it. Like, no one knew any of this was going to happen. None of these guys could even get a record deal, much less imagine be on TV. And you're right, like it was all punk and new wave and the Go-Go's and, you know, and Motels and the Knack and all this stuff. And all the bands talk about that. And I think that was probably one of the things that Tom and I were most surprised about as we went through this book, and really seeing, and, you know, we were both around then and we were both listening to music, but I don't think that we realized how out of fashion this music was. I certainly didn't realize it, because to me it seemed, you know, I didn't grow up on Led Zeppelin and Cream and all that stuff. So I didn't have this sort of background where I could see where all these bands were pulling from. And it just seemed like super brand new to me, the way that they were presenting it and the way they looked and sounded and all of that, where in the same way that new wave sounded and looked new to me. But when you read the book and you hear these guys talk, the guys from Quiet Riot and Motley Crue and Dokken and all that, like nobody wanted anything to do with them, at least from a label perspective, because they saw it as dinosaur music and they saw it as very old and out of touch. And, you know, it wasn't until this sort of Quiet Riot breakthrough and all that, and around the same time Motley's getting signed. But, you know, that's why they're putting out their own records. They're creating their own record labels, or, you know, Rat's putting out a record on Time Coast, and, you know, Dokken is on Carrere in France, and Motley's doing Leather record. Like none of these guys had any other options. Yeah. So they're doing it the same way punk bands did it, in the same way indie rock bands do it, in the same way any scene does it. But for whatever reason, they don't get the recognition of having those roots, you know. And so we tried to really expose those roots.
And Bob, you touched on something, Bob, about you know, grunge killing hair metal, and I don't believe that, because I just, for me, and the guys touch it, and it's a great kind of, you know, ending. It kind of, you know, gradually looks at the phase out and whatever. And, you know, I like to hear the guys like Tom and Rich opinion on that, you know, everything goes through its cycle. If you take just in the metal rock world, so I'm not going to talk about pop because I don't know it, but if you just take, you know, new album, you take your Saxons, your, you know, your Tigers of Pantang, whatever, like they lasted in the new album years from, you know, 78, 79 to 82-ish, they give or take a year. You know, then the hair metal came in 82, and that was done by 90. And then, you know, grunge came in 90, that was done by 95. Then you had the new age of American heavy metal with Shadows Fall and Killswitch and whatever, and they were done by whatever. I just think it just went through a natural cycle. It just exhausted itself and it went away. It's not like, you know, Nirvana released Nevermind, and I think
what was overkill? It was overkill.
No, it was totally overkill. But
it was done by the media too. The media is the one that really pushed it. They said, this is a new thing. This is what we're getting behind. You had radio stations. You had all the magazines that you had MTV. You had everyone saying, okay, this is the new thing. Let's all get on this. And that's what the labels pushed. And, you know,
So what I'd like to hear your thoughts on that, Tom or Rich, just about the ending of this genre. I don't think the grunge killed it. I think it just ran out of steam. You know, that's my personal opinion.
I think that's true. I think it ran out of steam. I'm sorry I keep shifting, and to the audience, the reason I moved and it looks like I'm in a very weird space is because of my dogs. It's not because I thought that this was the ideal place to do a podcast broadcast from. But it had run out of steam in the ways that all movements did. It had a very good run. I think that it was because it had reached sort of its it was like Rome and its decadence or whatever. It had reached that point. I think that hair metal was incredibly vulnerable to something new and exciting coming out. You know, so like Nirvana comes in and we're using Nirvana as a catch-all phrase for Pearl Jam, Alice in Chains, you know, all of these bands. But these bands come in and they're really good, you know, like, and they've got really good songs. And like, you know, that's the one thing everybody, even in our book, says. They hear Smells Like Teen Spirit and nobody's just like, oh, this band sucks. They're like, oh, that's a great song. Let's take them out on tour. You know, it's a great song. And so I think that it was just very vulnerable to be toppled by something that was new, because people want something new, and maybe also, you know, kids want their own music. So if you're 15 in 92, you know, and you're looking at, again, like a band even like a Poison that's been around since, you're like, well, I want my thing. Yeah. But I think what is unique about this music, but about the end of it, isn't whether Nirvana killed it or not. I think it was a combination of factors. I think people were tired of it. But what happened that was unusual.
I was tired of it.
Yeah. What happens that's unusual, though, is that literally everyone involved with the scene becomes untouchable overnight.
Yeah.
Like that's the thing when I'm interviewing these producers, like Bo Hill's like, phone stopped ringing, Michael Wagner, I got out of producing, like none of these people could work anymore.
Yeah.
None of the bands could work anymore. It was like overnight. You couldn't, we have Brian Forsyth from Kix is talking about how after Kix, kind of falls apart and he's auditioning for the Wall. He's a great guitar player. So he's like auditioning for the Wallflowers, in, I don't know what year, 94 or something. And Kix had like a number 9 single. Like it's a big deal. Like they had a platinum record and he's just like not mentioning that he was in Kix.
Right.
Like you couldn't even talk about it.
Yeah.
You couldn't.
Well, that was the thing. It was like an embarrassment to the people.
Yeah.
Would look and the funny thing,
that's a unique thing for that, for the amount of hate and that like suddenly everyone is like, this music sucks.
Yeah.
That is unique. Like maybe it happened with disco, but that is totally what is odd about this, the hostility.
Yeah. And if you look at most of those bands, when they started out, it was the metal bands that were taking them out on their first tours, from Alice in Chains to, to Stone Temple Pilots to, Pearl Jam, whatever. They were kind of, I used to go to those Concrete forums, and to me, it was all kind of metal. It was all kind of, they would fit together in these bills with a Faith No More, and then you would have, Kix or whoever, Skid Row and Pantera and all these bands play. And it was kind of like, all right, this is cool, everyone. And then it had that separation, where this is not cool anymore. But, a lot of those bands, especially the heavier bands, Metallica and Megadeth, they were the ones taking out Alice in Chains and Stone Temple Pilots and Korn and all the, the grunge and the new metal and all that stuff. And then when it came to all these bands came on top, they didn't do anything to help out the metal bands. It was like, forget it. We're on top now. That's kind of the way it seemed to me. You didn't see that kind of, you guys helped us out in the beginning. We're going to help you out, get you on a tour. Until now, years later, when it's kind of cool to be that. But during that time when it was uncool, it was like they disassociated themselves from that scene.
But I think Bob as well. I mean, you talk about with Slaughter, which you didn't mention yet. Like so many. I know we're coming up on time, guys, but like you look at the Slaughter, a Dokken, a Trickster in the later years. Who else? All of the above, Poison, whatever. Like they just toured the US constantly. Didn't really touch overseas because they never had to. The money was here, the market was there. And they were either on headlining, arenas or, mid-sized theaters or whatever, or they were on, great solid bills or whatever. But then you take two bands in particular, Bon Jovi and Def Leppard, who were right in the middle of that scene, who navigated the scene because they had a huge fan base overseas because they toured overseas continuously. I saw Bon Jovi 15 times in Ireland, not because I'm the biggest Bon Jovi fan in the world. I do like Bon Jovi, but they just kept on coming back. So I just kept going to see him. So they solidified their overseas base, and I know they had a huge following in Asia. In Australia, they were huge. Def Leppard, pretty much the same. I'm not saying the records were great. Faith is a good album. Slang is so-so, whatever, personal opinion. But they had that overseas base to go to. So when the US dried up, they said, fuck it, I'm going to go over here and make some money. So they didn't sell as many albums. They probably paid to play to 15,000 people instead of 25. But the cash kept coming in. They kept their profile up there. And I think that's a detriment to a lot of US bands. And I know that from growing up in Ireland. I used to travel in the UK a lot, that they just didn't come over here because they never gave it the attention and didn't need to because the money was here. But that bit them in the ass when 1990, 91 hit. They had nowhere to go.
Well, it's like that joke, we're big in Japan.
Right.
A lot of the bands, those bands from the 80s, a lot of them, they say they disappeared, but they didn't realize Dokken and Mr. Big, they were playing Budokan, huge arenas. Yeah. I mean, Mr. Big is still huge out there. I mean, they'll literally play, sell out giant arenas and stadiums. And a lot of those bands, even the bands that never made it huge here, like the Dangers and all those bands, they could go to Japan. So, they did continue their careers. So they didn't, a lot of them did. The bands that didn't break up, that didn't go over through that turmoil. But anyway, yeah, we should close this up in a bit, but go ahead. You were saying, Rich?
No, I was just going to say, and this isn't the best example because it's the Scorpions and they're not an American band to begin with, but they say in the book, in that last part where we're talking about sort of the 90s and everything going downhill, I think it's Klaus Meine who says, when everything took a dive, we just went to other places. He's like, we spent 10 years playing in China, playing in Russia, playing wherever, and kicking ass, and he's like, and then 10 years later, when the tide turned again in the US, we came back and just picked up where we left off. And like, if you had the ability to, not every band had the ability to do that, but if you built that base and that foundation and you could do that, like for them, they continued on exactly, just as popular as they were, just in a different part. Of the
People
world.
don't realize Wind of Change was one of the biggest singles ever at that time.
Sure,
and they might have not been as big here in the US, but as far as worldwide, all over Europe and Russia and all that, that was a huge song. Yeah.
But I feel like like what you're saying, I never thought of it in that perspective. But yeah, it wasn't the glam metal, hair metal thing was like a uniquely American phenomenon, even if you had bands from other places, or like Mike Tramp is, a Dane, but
Europe,
those bands go. They like I don't know. I don't think Poison could go sell out in like La Reine de Bercy in Paris or something. They didn't have. It was an American. When Rat talks about doing like 300 shows after their first record comes out, I'm sure 275 of them are, covering the U.S. And again, that's. The inverse is true too, right? The reason British bands can never break here is that they don't want to put in the time.
Sure.
They're like, I've got to play Peoria and I've got to play this place, I got to play that place, and the American hard rock bands did put in the time. They hit every market, tertiary, so that they were going, and European bands often can't handle what it takes to break in America.
Right. And a lot of the European and British bands like Bonfire, Heavy Petting, Tiger Tails, and just I think at the top of my head, like they weren't necessarily great bands. They didn't have the bases, the content there. Thunder, whatever, had a kind of a drop in the ocean over here. But they never, you're right, they never put in the groundwork over here, and they just never got picked up on the tours. And if they did, they blew it and got thrown off after 5 dates because they're assholes or whatever. I don't know, but you're right. So it does work both ways for sure. But you mentioned something about the late 80s, and I think it was Cherry Pie 89. I can't remember the year, escapes 89, 90. So
it 90.
Yeah, so that's an anomaly right there, because that sold I think 3 million copies or something right as Tide turning. So they really got the tail end of that time period, and then went all cool with Dog Eat Dog 2 years later, and then totally blew it afterwards. But
early 90s was still huge for hair metal, all over MTV. I mean, Slaughter, all those bands, and that's really when you had all those, the Firehouse and the Dangers and the Toras and the blah blah blahs and all these, and that's the overkill really started in the 90s. But back, and then you had Jackal that start 93, 94, that kind of. I mean, they were more of a southern, raw, but it still did go. But I'm sorry, go ahead. Yeah. But you did have that. I don't know if it was if it was in Europe at the time, but over here it was still pretty big.
But you see, I never changed. I never. We had this discussion before, Bob, because I was I just bought whatever was coming out. So when Nirvana came out, I was never a huge Nirvana fan, but I bought Alice in Chains and I bought Pearl Jam, but I also bought the new Warrant album. I didn't differentiate. I didn't put the marker in the sand and go, well, that's all of a sudden shit, yet I'm listening to it for 7 years. So I just continued on buying the hair metal bands until they kind of died out a little bit. All like Winger, Winger released Pull, I believe, in 1990. That's a fucking phenomenal album. Nobody knows it even exists, because nobody gave it a shot, because it's Winger on the cover. And then you got the whole Beavis and Butthead thing, which I know the guys touched on in the book too, which is so funny. But that's a well documented story. But I just think people just had a a small brain and listen to the media and just switch to the new thing, which I never did. I just listened to the new thing with the old thing, so.
Like what you like. Yeah, sure.
That's it.
Yeah. Well, gentlemen, again, the book, Nothing But a Good Time. I can't say enough great things about it. And this is just a book you could just pick up and just read and just get lost in it. And it just really brings you back to that era, which I love. And, again, that was my influence in doing the documentaries, is to bring the listener back to that era and tell it from the band's point of view. And I love the fact that you guys did that, because so many journalists love to put in their own opinions about how it was. And especially a lot of journalists that weren't there at the time, and you're like reading it. It's like, no, it wasn't like that. Let the bands tell the story. Let them tell their story, And that's what you guys did, and it's just a fantastic book. But I'll let you guys both close about the book, and if you want to give out some contact information where people could get in touch with you, or where they could do pre-order. Do you have pre-orders on the book?
It's available now at Amazon or wherever you like to buy your books. It is available now, so you can pre-order it. And I will say, without being that, pre-ordering is awesome for us, because it all goes to first week sale. So if you think you're going to buy this book, please buy it now or
there you go.
Yeah, and we're on all the socials as well. On Facebook, Nothing But a Good Time Book, and Instagram, Nothing But a Good Time Book, and we have contests and all sorts of things going on there. Book giveaways. We have a guitar giveaway going on right now. We have an Epiphone Les Paul with Nothing But a Good Time graphic from the cover of the book on the guitar. So it's pretty loud, pretty cool.
Is it right behind you?
Yes, here.
Yes, got to show everyone. Oh, wow.
Look at that.
Oh,
look
that's
at that.
beautiful.
Yeah, very cool.
Well,
So there's a couple of those. So we're glad we got it done.
yeah.
I keep telling Rich, I don't know once the book comes out, or I'm like, what am I going to do?
Well, I got to ask you, you mentioned it'll be coming out on an audiobook. Who is going to do the narration? Will it be the two of you, or you're going to have an artist do it? Or I mean, it would be great if for each quote, because I'm wondering how you'll do it, because each quote is from an artist. Is, if you have D. Snyder do the book, is he going to say, okay, Brian Forsyth says this, and then so-and-so says this? Or if you get each member to do the talking, that would be, or you actually have the recordings, right? If you could pull it out. I don't know how good the audio would be, but if you, I'm just wondering how you would do that. Go ahead.
We read, thankfully we didn't have to do the whole thing, because we read our introduction together. And I have to tell you, talk about things that you think would just be straightforward and easy, but are really hard. Reading a book, like doing an audio book, particularly of stuff you've written yourself, is not easy. We hired the publishers, hired a voice. There's a male and a female voice actor, like they're book people who do this for a living, because again, like what you're saying, there's so many voices. You need somebody who actually has acting ability to be able to switch characters over and over and over and over and over again, and remember, like, how did I do Nikki Sixx? 20. So we went through a bunch of audition tapes, and the people we got, I think, are really great. But it would have been awesome to have everybody do it, but I think we'd be working on it till
that would be hard.
2040.
Yeah.
Well, great. Well, once again, Nothing But a Good Time. Anything in closing, gentlemen? Mr. Brennan, or either of you guys?
I just love the book. I love the order. I love the fact that you got a different version of events, like very quick. And J.K. Lee talks about the infamous snorting of the ants, and he gave his reckoning. And then when Ozzy was licking his piss, he said, okay, I'm done, I'm out of here. So he just walked away. So I love that it's not just one person telling a story. You've got this this kind of layers of what really happened. So there's so much going on. I read it in 2 days, and that's the quickest I've ever read a book ever. And I mean ever, because I do not read books. I was just captivated. So I loved it, guys. Loved it.
Awesome. Thank you. I would just say thank you guys for having us. And Bob,
absolutely,
thank you for being one of the voices in the book. And
I totally
thank you for helping out. That was great.
I totally appreciate it. And the way it came out was brilliant. I love the way you pieced my few quotes in there. Again, I was mentioning to Rich, I remember talking to you, but I don't remember the actual interview. I hope I didn't say anything stupid. Then when I read this, I go, okay, it's all good. But yeah, that again, I can't say enough good things about the book. Definitely pre-order the book and pre-order the audio if the audio is
how you roll. Audio is how you roll. It came out. It came out really well. So we're
great.
That as well.
All right, man. I'm looking forward to that as well. But anything you guys need, if you guys want to come back on the show to talk about anything or any bands in particular that you covered in the book, because I know we could go on, especially Tom and I, we could go on for hours talking about this book. But once again, nothing but a good time. Order it from Amazon, pre-order it, and do it now. Thank you again, gentlemen.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Talk to you soon.
Thank you, guys.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye.